Erica here, and I'm here today with a book review. Today I'm reviewing George Saunders' Lincoln in the Bardo, which was published today, February 14th in the US. Those of you who have watched my channel for a while know that I'm a huge fan of George Saunders' work, particularly his short stories and novellas, and I was very excited last year when I heard that he was releasing a novel this year. This is his first novel, and it is quite interesting, as one might expect. George Saunders generally writes fabulous fiction. That means that his stories are very literary in terms of the quality of the writing and character development, but that they have a bit of a sci-fi or magical realism or dystopian or fantasy bent to them, and he utilizes a variety of different genres that he pulls into his stories. His stories are generally kind of weird and a little fucked up, and in keeping with that, Lincoln in the Bardo is a little weird and a little fucked up. So this novel takes place on the day of Willie Lincoln's death and funeral. Willie Lincoln was Abraham Lincoln's son, so it takes place in America during the Civil War. But most of the novel doesn't actually take place in America. It takes place in this space that's kind of an in-between space where the characters are in between life and death, and they're stuck in this graveyard and they can only come out at night. And it tells the story of Willie's death and Abraham Lincoln's grief and Willie's grief at his father's grief, and it's a really beautiful story but told in a very interesting way. Before I go any further, I would like to say that in my personal opinion, having read 4 collections of George Saunders short fiction as well as one of his children's books, I do not recommend starting with Lincoln in the Bardo as your first George Saunders read. I think that it is a good idea to dip your toes into his short fiction before you try to tackle this novel. His style can take a little getting used to, and this novel definitely took even me a while to get used to, knowing his previous work and being familiar with kind of how he sets up stories, and even then it took me a while to figure out what the hell was going on, so I don't personally necessarily recommend that you start here with him. I will leave you to decide that on your own, but if it were me, I would not. So the novel kind of already has a weird premise, but the way it's told is what makes the story really unique. The chapters are generally pretty short, and you get a lot of different characters' perspectives, but the form in which George Saunders explores this kind of theme of loss in this place in between death and life is what really makes the novel special, and what makes it also a little bit hard to kind of get a grasp on, and makes it difficult to figure out what is actually going on. So different characters tell their story differently, but most of the story is narrated by 3 primary characters. All 3 of these are men who are stuck in the graveyard and have really no connection to the Lincolns. They weren't even alive during the Civil War. They don't even know that Abraham Lincoln is president because they died so long ago. They just happen to be the people who stumble upon Willie Lincoln as he enters the in-between space after his death. I should note that the in-between is not really the word that is used to describe the place in the book. The characters just refer to it as this place, but for me, when I'm talking about it, that's kind of the easiest way for me to articulate what the setting of the book is. So these 3 characters narrate much of the story, and they narrate it in very much the form of a play or a screenplay, a dramatic structure. So each character's dialogue is written, and then it's written, the character who said it is written. But George Saunders takes this play form and he kind of magnifies it and even blows it further out of proportion, in which there are no stage directions, there's no there's no description of the setting. The characters describe everything that's going on, everything that everyone around them is doing. And he made it even a little bit meta, to the point that one character would tell you what one of the other 3 primary narrators had said. So he kind of plays with this form a little bit and flips it around and kind of pushes it to see what he can do with it, I felt like. Other chapters of the story are told from a little bit more of a historical perspective, but they're laid out in much the same way, where there are quotes from historical texts describing Abraham Lincoln and Willie Lincoln's death and what that meant for the family and the country. And it'll be a whole chapter of just little blurbs and the citation of where that came from. So those two are the primary kind of forms of writing that Saunders utilizes throughout the novel, but mainly for the Lincoln's perspectives, he does also utilize a kind of stream of consciousness style as well. So when Willie Lincoln or Abraham Lincoln are the primary focus in the chapter, it's very much that you're inside their head and their thoughts don't necessarily connect, and it really gives you a picture into the grief that each of these characters is experiencing. Thematically, as I said, this is a novel about grief and how we deal with grief. It's a novel about how we perceive death, and even to some extent how the dead perceive life in a very bizarre way. So it kind of looks at both sides of that coin, and it's really beautifully written. Like I said, it took me a little while to get into it and to figure out what was going on. I was worried for a while because I did receive an ebook arc of this through NetGalley. I was worried for a while that like the arc was just kind of like defunct, like it wasn't formatted correctly, because it was a little hard to follow and a little weird looking, but I soon realized that was not the case, and I just had not been following the story properly. But once I got into it, after I stuck it out through like the first 40 pages or so, it became a really beautiful novel. It's also very funny at times. The three narrators who I mentioned earlier, who are in the graveyard, kind of narrating their experiences and the experiences of Willie and Abraham Lincoln, are pretty hilarious. So that was a nice juxtaposition of kind of that comic relief with this overall kind of sense of dread and grief and doom. I really appreciated that. Overall, I loved this novel. Like I said, it's not an easy novel. It is quite difficult, and I do recommend starting with George Saunders' shorter fiction first, but I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars, not quite 5 stars for me, and I think mostly because I was really lost in the beginning and I was a little exasperated with it, but I do think that it is a book that I will reread again and again, and I have not yet received my hardcover copy. It should be coming later today because I pre-ordered it, but I will have that soon, and it is definitely a book I will revisit. So if you have read this book and would like to talk about it in the comments, let us do that. If you have any questions about the book, I would be happy to answer them. And I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will see you soon. Bye.